We're going to begin our next segment, which is into our panels, okay? So our first panel will be conflict and competition in cyberspace. It's going to be moderated today by Professor Fred Turner. So with that, Fred, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, James. Okay, so as the captain said, I am Fred Turner. I'm a member of the JMO faculty and was a 30-year Navy Intel officer. A little bit of background here, why there's only one person. We were victims of the same weather that a lot of other folks were. So two of our panelists are joining us from Zoomland, okay? ROE for this morning. What I will do is I'll introduce, of course, the panel. Then I'll have each of the panelists provide about 15 to 20 minutes of opening remarks. I don't think anybody has slides. That's good. And then after that, I'll open it up to questions and answer from you all, okay? So as in JMO, we like to say we always start with the objective. So I should give you the objective of this panel, okay? What we're trying to do here is for you to begin to think, or for some of you to continue to think, about how much cyberspace operations will or will not be important in future conflicts and broader joint warfighting. I also know that you will address this question again during your time here at the Naval War College, so this is just a way to really start the process. So a few questions for you guys to ponder while the panelists are speaking, and then while you're thinking of some good questions for them. We're still struggling with and need to know how much cyberspace operations, how much they will affect the warfight. Will they have a major effect, a minor effect, or something in between? I would also argue that that goes for information operations as well. Our keynote speaker introduced that topic earlier. By the way, I do separate cyberspace operations from information operations. Also, several recent papers have suggested cyberspace operations will at best be supporting operations in major conflicts. Or might you eventually see them as supported operations? Don't know. Does where we are on the competition continuum matter when you're answering these questions? Does the level of war change the way you think about cyberspace operations, whether you're at the strategic, operation, or tactical levels? And the reason why these questions are important, of course, is they will inform resource decisions by the service staffs, by the joint force, and they will also inform the time and effort you put into them if you're at a combatant command staff, a component staff, or in any other planning group you may be part of in the future. Now, I challenged the panelists to look at this through the lens of the Russia-Ukraine war. There are a fair number of lessons that have already come out of that war that might help us or inform us going forward. But I'd also argue, and I would not be surprised if we hear references to other enemies or potential enemies such as China, Iran, non-state actors, or other competitors out there. So, to answer these questions, or to help us answer these questions, we have three panelists. The first one who will join us from Zoomland is Rear Admiral Berg. She's heading up to Fort Meade soon to be the Deputy Commander for Navy Space. She is leaving OpNav N3N5 as the N3N5 Bravo. Has formerly been USCYBERCOM J5 and AFRICOM J2, well qualified. There's also Mr. Gavin Wild. Mr. Wild is a senior fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he is an expert in Russia and information warfare. And last but not least is Vice Admiral White, USN retired, former commander of Fleet Cyber Command 10th Fleet, a whole host of other hats as well, as we were discussing earlier. Has also been commander of the Cyber National Mission Force, as well as the Indo-PACOM J2. So with that, what I'd like to do is, and hopefully we'll get her up on Zoom, have Rear Admiral Berg kick us off here.
Okay, hey, can you hear me? Fred, can you hear me? Great. Hey, everyone. So Admiral Heidi Berg, really wish I could be there. I did have all the joys of travel yesterday, a full day at the airport, lots of time loading up, etc., without the joys of actually being up there where I would get to be out of DC. I could use all my good Pentagon jokes and the opportunity to hit lobster night with Admiral Garvin, Admiral Walker, and Professor Turner. And most importantly, a chance to really meet some of the future leaders, and really envious of all of you there and what you get to do. Couple things I'm going to talk a little bit. This is an education format, and so Professor Turner wanted me to make sure I hit some education, so I will describe very briefly kind of an overview of cyber threats that we see and what cyber operations across the spectrum of conflict look like. And then do want to spend a little bit of time looking at Russia, Ukraine, and other emergent technologies and the conflation of these and what this may mean for you as commanders as you go on in your careers. But first, just a little bit, Admiral Turner gave a little bit of background. I'm a career cryptologist. So I commissioned out of the Academy over 3 decades ago, and then went and worked in cryptology from both airborne platforms, surface platforms, subsurface, special operations, and space. And so the real beauty of this is it gives you an opportunity to look across all these domains in order to better understand both how they integrate and how they must integrate for modern warfare. I've also had a chance to work really extensively in the interagency, which I think is important and increasingly important. Time with both CIA, DIA, and then working with State Department, Department of Justice, which is really a lot of time with the FBI, and DHS and CISA, which is important in this field in particular. But want to emphasize a period of time that I had in the White House, which gave me great insights into some of the senior decision making that goes on and why cyberspace, and particularly some of the emergent domains, will be increasingly important. And then lastly, served in the joint world. And I know we've had a number of folks. I heard some of the Q&A there from the joint side, and we spell joint ARMY. And so it was a lot of time getting to know the Army and Army doctrine and what they're doing, which again, really helpful, both at a geographic combatant command at AFRICOM, where we had plenty of Russia going on. Max Brooks had alluded to election interference, but we had Wagner forces all over the place that we got to contest and confront, as well as significant Chinese investment and Chinese troops working through, again, UN security forces, and then clearly lots of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as well as really looking at that whole government approach and seeing how cyberspace and space investments were taking place across the continent. And then, of course, time as a J5 at CyberCom, where I had a great chance to work at a functional combatant command and really continue to develop my understanding, as well as our employment as a nation as we develop and continue to mature the cyberspace domain. And then most recently, I've checked in, so I'm the Deputy Commander of Fleet Cybercom and Nav Space, but coming out of N3 and N5 Bravo, and again, Arsenio Gilday put me an IW officer in that position very deliberately as we look at the growing importance of the cyberspace and space domains, but also, and I think this is critically, really looking at the CNO transition as CNO Franchetti came in, and where the Navy needs to go in terms of preparing for potential conflict. So that was really one of my focuses. And then, and this will happen to all of you, the enemy gets a vote. My boss, I've been in the job about a month and a half. my boss, Vice Admiral Black, decided to take hard leave, where he was going to go off hunting in the wilds of Virginia. No cell phone access, isn't going to check internet. And the day his leave started was 7 October. So I spent most of my time consumed with both Israel-Hamas conflict, Red Sea operations, JLATs, you name it. That was really the focus of the last year. And I think some of the comments I'll expand on that Max Brooks had referred to are incredibly important as we start to look at and continue to illuminate what is the future and evolving warfare. So first, I want to ask the audience, and I won't be able to see you, so who considers themselves a cyber warrior? Raise your hands, please. So for those of you in the audience, look around. These are the guys that you want to sit next to and share the comms with, because they're going to be taking notes and be very focused on the details as they proceed. But really, what I'm asking is, when we think of cyberspace operations and understanding this domain, this is a warfighting domain that is commander's business. You must understand cyberspace and space if you want to detect threats, employ weapons, or command and control over the horizon. Those are critical dependencies that we have with everything that we do, and you must ensure that you understand. So again, let me just review real quick what an overview of our adversary. So first, China, most active strategic adversary. They expect conflict in cyberspace, and they have been organizing, recruiting, preparing for conflict in cyberspace. They see gaining cyberspace dominance is an absolute key to achieving operational success in conflict. And they see this because of what they determine, the interconnectedness between weapon systems, information systems, and communication systems that provide strategic opportunity for them. They have also conducted, and when we think of, like, I love the way Professor Turner had referred to it in terms of, is cyberspace really going to be decisive? And I would ask you to look at China a generation ago and where they are now. What they have achieved in the course of a generation, economically, diplomatically, militarily, is because of cyber espionage. That has given them the advantage to leapfrog. You look at their weapon systems, a lot of them look very, very similar to a lot of Western weapon systems, but this cyber espionage has given them advantage in every sphere. And so it has a long-term strategic impact. It is an area that they see is an asymmetric advantage for themselves, and they are investing in it. And they seek to undermine the U.S. competitive advantage through cyberspace. And I would call attention, it's just one of many, many examples, but when we think of their positioning for operations in cyberspace, Volt Typhoon. So there has been a National Security Agency released a cybersecurity advisory, which describes this in unprecedented detail as they look at Volt Typhoon. And this was China's look to embed capabilities using living off the land techniques, so using typical administration. So it's very hard to detect through endpoint detection. It requires actually hunting on your networks in order to be able to effectively detect these implants, but it's on U.S. critical infrastructure. And it's just really focused on a variety of sectors across critical infrastructure to embed these capabilities. Second, Russia, another strategic adversary in this space, highly sophisticated, adaptable, and completely undeterred. They, again, also see this as a critical and asymmetric advantage, as had been described by Max, but I think as we'll describe during the course of this entire engagement. They target government networks, critical infrastructure, ICS, SCADA networks. Their focus on information superiority and saturating the information environment and the information space, but also the development of offensive cyber threat. And they have employed it and they've used it. I mean, and we have seen this for decades. Frankly, if you go back to Georgia, Ukraine in 2015 and 2016, where they attacked the critical infrastructure, Estonia, and then currently now in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But they're regularly targeting U.S. critical infrastructure in the defense industrial base. And most importantly, as they look at cyber espionage as an absolutely critical tool for them to gain advantage against both NATO adversaries, the U.S., but really global adversaries. Iran. So Iranian cyber actors, increasingly sophisticated cyber capabilities. They do focus on suppressing social and political actors, their own people. They have conducted attacks on critical infrastructure. They focus on regional adversaries, but they've got global capability. I think one example that's a good one to highlight is an attack that they took, fairly sweeping attack using road sweep ransomware in 2022 in July against the Albanian government, who was hosting individuals that they sought to again affect and deliver cost to the Albanian government. They've also carried out significant attacks on the U.S. and particularly if you look at U.S. election interference, they sought to undermine former President Trump's reelection campaign in 2020 and conducted a wide-scale, again, AI-enabled attacks where they put together both thousands of content online, established websites that were providing death threats against U.S. Election officials. They had some threatening spoof emails, and then they also had deepfake videos. And one of them, which we released preemptively, actually was pretty impressive in terms of its engineering. They actually used Metallica as their the background music for it, as they depicted, again, sought to undermine the U.S. election. DPRK, and this is one that I think is interesting. It's really focused more on revenue generation. Again, cybercrime through cryptocurrency heists, bank heists, also ransomware actions. But they have demonstrated, again, an intent to use both destructive and disruptive. I think the Sony Pictures attack is a great example, right? The movie that depicted the assassination of Kim Jong-un. In order to exert a reprisal, they conducted a pretty comprehensive attack, but are consistently honing their skills, increasing in their sophistication. And this is the real challenge. We see the bar to entry in cyberspace is lowering, and this has created a much more contested, noisy environment that gets harder when it comes to attribution. Also, the fact that both China, Russia, and Iran also use non-state actors to execute their state objectives. But we see cyber criminals who are out there for profit, hacktivists who are ideologically motivated. I mean, KillNet's another one from Russia with love that we see. All of these operations, or all of these actors, make it very, very difficult to continue to ensure that we've got clarity in cyberspace for our own actions. So I'll quickly describe operations in cyberspace across the spectrum of conflict for those of you who are not as focused on this. Although, useful idiots, I think we look at the CrowdStrike action that has recently taken place, and it should demonstrate not just the vulnerabilities of the systems that we have, again, the reliance on a pretty small group of cybersecurity companies that again, in order to go after these really sophisticated malign actors, we must be able to provide these cybersecurity actors great insight into the administrative networks, and that creates its own vulnerabilities. But that should, again, start to look at when we think of what has always been, from logistics to deployment from CONUS, all of these things that we had not traditionally seen as contested. If they're going to be contested in a future conflict, we've gotten to be able to build resistance and resilience in our forces. So as we look across the spectrum of conflict, there were pre-2018 assessments that actions that took place in cyberspace would be inherently escalatory. And in fact, as we have been conducting and gaining our expertise and in the reps and sets in cyberspace, we discovered the opposite is true. It is really a much more nuanced tool. You have reversible or non-reversible effects, attribution or non-attribution. You can obfuscate it, kinetic and non-kinetic. It really provides a much more nuanced range of options to our policymakers and to our decision makers, as well as kind of face-saving off-ramps that are possible as well. But the environment has rapidly evolved and is rapidly evolving. I talked about how noisy it is. This is one of the areas that we've discovered that campaigning is critically important. both campaigning outside our networks and outside our borders in order to maintain our cyber superiority. This builds resilience in our own force. We want to contest adversary campaigns so that that our adversaries don't get an opportunity to win without fighting. We want to set the conditions should we need to rapidly transition into conflict, and we want to demonstrate credible capabilities in order to deter our adversaries in cyberspace. This will build our capability and capacity as well. From the range I look at, the far end, I'm pointing to the left in my mental map in terms of, in peacetime and in competition. We've got our DoDIN operations, our Department of Defense Information Networks. And again, we sustain, when we talked about, and I'll talk a little bit about the changing character of war, sustain over 1 million attacks a day that go on. So when we look at building resilience and that defensive posture, absolutely critically important that we have both zero trust infrastructure, that we're focused on next generation encryption, and that really want to build up that defensive posture. Defensive cyberspace operations, so again, defending forward, these are critical both to identify evolving tactics, techniques, and procedures of our adversaries, as well as expose the malware that they're employing. We use this not just for ourselves, but also defense support of civil authorities and counter ransomware actors, and work with both our defense industrial base and increasingly a broader range of industries we look to increase sensing. And this is really important. And I think as we look at the evolution of warfare writ large, our ability to interact with industry is increasingly critical. They are leading both in emergent technologies and a lot of innovation that's out there. But when it comes to cyberspace and space, our ability to effectively leverage, and particularly when it comes to sensing the environment, when we look at the about 1.4 million endpoints of our Department of Defense information networks, when we start to expand that with our partners with industry, it expands into 1 to 2 billion endpoints that allow us to get a much better sense of this environment real time. Information operations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that because that is one of the areas that I think will become critical. And there were some great points raised in the earlier discussion. And then offensive cyberspace operations, where there's a lot of discussion and focus on, but again, I'd have people continue to focus on defensive operations, DoDIN operations, and resilience. But we must have credible capabilities to be able to effectively deliver cyber effects against both malign actors in cyberspace and against kinetic targets. And as I talked about, these unique attributes that we have in cyberspace have proven to be really effective for a couple of reasons. I'll use one example. So as we all know, and you guys study, Article 4 and Article 5 in NATO, there was a cyber attack that took place from Russia again early in 2022 that impacted about 60,000 users across Europe. Should that have been a kinetic attack, it would have clearly led to a much more constrained series of options and a much more constrained debate. As it was a cyber attack, it did allow for much greater flexibility on the part of our senior political leaders in terms of the discussion of does this, what kind of response is mandated. And those are really a lot of the discussions that we continue to have both at the OSD level with the Secretary of Defense and with the White House as we look at what these options are and how we can leverage cyberspace response options or operations in cyberspace, both when commensurate to cyber attacks, but also as we look at integrated fires and how we might best employ it. So Russia-Ukraine, again, this is the first, large-scale protracted conflict between advanced militaries that we've seen in a generation. We have been studying it closely, and this is again across all of the various domains, and really looking at the first time we're seeing the interaction of both proven and emergent technologies in combat. And how that is giving us some indications of the changing character of war. And I'll just hit on a couple points, and I'm sure more will come up in the question and answer. And one is, asymmetric denial. And this is a big one, because again, I came into the military at the end of the Cold War. I was one of those folks, in the 90s that Max had referred to, where in fact, when Yeltsin deployed his fleet into the Mediterranean for the first time in 7 years, and they had gotten a bit rusty, both figuratively as well as literally. We provided them, a series of U.S. pubs to help them operate safely in the Mediterranean because they brought Kuznetsov down, which was their heavy aircraft carrying cruiser. And we're really concerned, and we thought, hey, the Russians are going to be your friend. Let's embrace them closely. And we did have those that were citing some of the and again, with the rise of Putin and what we saw since 2012, certainly has driven us along a much different path, but they continue to be significant adversaries. But asymmetric denial, where again, the Ukrainians without a navy have denied both air and sea superiority to the Russians, and have had the ability to employ both through their USVs and UAVs very effectively inflicted significant harm, to include the latest sinking of a Kilo submarine. Protraction, and it really has been where decisive blows have been hard to land and hard to inflict, where we've been able to see how small scale gains have taken place, but really settling into this long protraction. Commercial tech, and this is not just the defense industrial base, it has been absolutely critical to rapidly respond and to build resilience of the forces. And there's more detail as we look at the need to leverage cloud infrastructure for rapid endpoint protection, to look at the diversification of your data centers to be able to reconstitute after a kinetic attack. But this leveraging of commercial tech has been absolutely vital, and sensing, and how you sense and how you have both confidence in your sensing. That high-low mix, the mass of the cheap systems that can generate strong defense and attrite exquisite capabilities has been enormously significant for the conflict. Small and highly capable maneuver forces can still deliver critical advantage at when employed appropriately. When it comes to, I heard there was a logistician in the place. I mean, logistics, as we've often talked about, being absolutely vital. We've seen how just-in-time logistics that we'd pushed to in the 90s and the early 2000s will be quickly defeated, and had to rapidly shift. The Ukrainians rapidly shift into this agile basing and dispersal to minimize the loss, and as well as deter, but then also how they have been employed and reshaped their logistics infrastructure. And then when we think about the investments that we need to take in order to shift, and I think there were a couple questions that talked about this changing character of war. There is a blurring between war and peace. We've referred to it. When I talk in cyberspace, our cyberspace actors are in conflict every single day. The timing of this slow buildup of a mountain of steel, and then we go to conflict, won't happen. It will be a rapid shift. And so you've got to be postured and positioned now to be able to rapidly transition into conflict. And then as we look at emergent and disruptive technologies, and this is where we're really excited with what the team has put together as we look at this agenda. Because AI is going to be bigger than electricity. It is going to absolutely transform how we work, the economy, biology. Every sector will be impacted. And we're already seeing it when we look at AI-enabled biotech that's coming up with new material science that is looking at hacking different biological systems. This is going to be enormous, and we must continue to be able to effectively manage it, govern it, and leverage it effectively for as we watch the changing battle space. Quantum, both in sensing and computing, is going to be significant. Autonomy, and we've already seen this with autonomous systems, particularly with what I've spent the last 7 months looking at with these autonomous very low-end weapon systems that the Houthis are employing, hypersonics, biotech that I talked about a little bit, and cyber. So understanding this changing environment, a lot of times it's like, hey, it's the R&D, the R&D guys, or it's my IT guy, I don't have to worry about it. It is commander's business. You, as the commander, must understand these domains. You must be able to leverage them to both impact and deliver integrated fires that is able to operate across all of these different domains, as well as effectively deter. You have to prioritize cybersecurity and building that resilience. If you don't, it will be relegated off and it won't be a priority. So your questions, your focus, your activity. I just had an opportunity to go out and brief all of the chiefs of European navies with Admiral Munch on behalf of Admiral Franchetti. And the focus, because almost every navy that we've had in Europe has been confronting cyber threats as well as cyber attacks by Russia. And so this is very real and is absolutely 100% commander's business. And then lastly, if deterrence fails, and deterrence is really building up our credible capabilities, preparing for war. So every day, Xi and Putin wake up and say, today's not the day. We can't go up. We can't win against the US. We can't win against NATO. So if deterrence fails and we go to war, we must be able to fight and win our nation's wars. And this time is absolutely critical for us to effectively prepare for combat. And that means we must be able to fight in all domains effectively, and again, be able to deliver that integrated fires. Hey, the CNO had an opportunity to serve on the CNO's transition team. She is focused on this, absolutely laser focused on how we, as a United States Navy, as part of what both Chairman Brown and the Secretary of Defense are doing is for the broader joint force and the Department of Defense, how can we posture and effectively prepare now for potential conflict should our adversaries choose to initiate it. So thanks very much. Appreciate the opportunity to offer a few words and look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Admiral. I will now turn it over to Mr. Wild.
Thanks, Captain Turner, and thank you to the Naval War College for having me. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but it's certainly an honor to be here virtually among stellar public servants and alongside such a stellar panel. So as we move towards this third year now of Russia's war on Ukraine, and as Ukraine has arguably been a laboratory for information warfare for at least a decade, I think it's fair to say that we now have ample reason to reinterrogate some of our core assumptions about information warfare and cyber conflict. And granted, doing so requires some measure of humility, as much remains unknown, including the degree to which some of the lessons we might seek to draw are unique to that conflict, or perhaps offer insights about cyber more broadly that we should think about. So in that same spirit of humility, I'll kind of start by taking a cheap shot at none other than Albert Einstein. He wrote in 1942 that one of the great achievements of the mechanical sciences was its adoption by those addressing problems in other disparate fields. He said, quote, "This contributes to the belief that it is possible to describe all natural phenomena in terms of simple forces between unalterable objects." And I guess the message I would leave with you today is that perhaps our greatest vulnerability in the information domain stems from this myth that the complex phenomena of warfare and coercion might be flattened and rendered into simple interactions between seemingly inert objects through our reliance on digital technologies. And judging from both Russia's and Ukraine's performances in cyberspace over the past decade, I would argue that there are three key areas we now need to reassess. 3 C's, as I call them, that have been perhaps over-theorized or under-scrutinized when it comes to cyberspace: complementarity, cumulativity, and correlation. Now, I realize that cutesy alliterations and potentially made-up words are usually the purview of Deloitte and McKinsey, but since I'm a mere think tanker, DoD is going to get these at a heavily discounted rate. So let's start with complementarity. In other words, the degree to which offensive cyber operations, or CNA, can serve as a reliable adjunct to kinetic attacks in conflict. Now, Russia certainly appears to have attempted at least one such combined operation in the early days of the war, as the GRU disrupted the Viasat network in hopes of crippling the communications networks of the Ukrainian armed forces, concurrent with their initial assault on Kyiv. Now, success there would require some pre-existing access to that network, some novel form of malware that had been tested for disruptive potential, and some degree of operational coordination among the Russian Armed Forces command structure and the general staff. As cyber scholar Max Smeets notes in his stellar book on military cyber forces called No Shortcuts, meeting these requirements is no small feat. Within a 2-day span, Russian hackers had breached a network service center located in Italy and deployed a previously unseen data wiper onto Viasat networks as its paratroopers laid siege on the outskirts of Kyiv. Now, as it turned out, Ukrainian armed forces had redundant comms channels, luckily, and were ultimately able to repel an otherwise shambolic effort by the Russian armed forces. The most decisive impacts of the Viasat attack in February of 2022 were arguably the downstream effects on nearly 6,000 wind turbines in Germany and disruptions to thousands of organizations across Europe, which had no relationship to the conflict whatsoever. So one of the lessons here that I draw is that while red team technical sophistication and even organizational coherence often take up the bulk of our focus, blue team redundancy and recoverability are just as decisive. Now, cyber scholar Lennart Maschmeyer helpfully describes this dynamic, which he calls a trilemma for cyber warfare. The demands of speed, impact, and control are inevitably at odds one with another. Addressing one of these demands will necessarily come at the cost of the other two. In the case of Viasat, the temporal urgency of the initial assault clearly overrode a more robust understanding of the Ukrainian forces' dependency on this network and any attempt to confine the effects to their intended target. And in stark terms, as Rear Admiral Berg noted, the victim also gets a vote. Anecdotally, I had the opportunity to visit Kyiv and meet with Ukrainian leaders on cyber issues in March of last year. And a deputy energy minister recounted to me some of the discussions about the vulnerability of digital rail switch networks to cyber attacks in the days prior to the full-scale invasion. Now, Kyiv was under no illusion that the movement of people and materiel in and around the country would be critical. So identifying fail-safes became the order of the day for these rail switching networks. Luckily, he said, the analog rail switchers, which literally operated on manual plugs similar to those used by telephone operators in the olden days, remained in good working order. We were grateful, he said, to the original engineers and installers of these systems, but of course we can't say that out loud. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, because most of these systems were put in place by the occupying Nazi forces in 1943. In terms of complementing combined arms maneuvers, joint operations, integrated warfighting, choose your moniker, this trilemma may mean that there is a ceiling of utility for offensive cyber operations beyond which we should question how pivotal a role they can play. Now, to speak to cumulativity, which I would define as essentially the notion that a preponderance of disruption over time can prove strategically decisive. Now, Moscow has long banked on this doctrine, and it's reflected in a broad swath of subversive activity, particularly in cyberspace. But as intelligence scholar Rory Cormack notes, this theory, quote, rests on untested and underspecified assumptions about a link between ambiguous, fragile cyber capabilities and the ability to effectively shape adversary perception and behavior in a desired direction. And as those who have long studied strategic bombing, economic sanctions from past eras might have predicted, such attempts at wide-scale coercion often spark more anger than anxiety, more resolve than resignation, and more dedication than despair. In short, it's important not to conflate putting pebbles in our adversary's shoes with necessarily cutting them off at the knees. Now, Moscow's information warfare theorizing and doctrine is heavy on this idea that continual disruption degrades decision-making, erodes morale, and might even lead to an adversary's total capitulation and collapse without firing a shot. A decade plus of Ukrainian resolve and resilience in the face of this digital onslaught lends us reason to be skeptical of this kind of calculus. Moreover, the degree to which Russia has trained its cyber and information operations predominantly on counter-value targets, governmental, social, and economic entities, rather than counter-force targets like the military, its weapon systems, its comms channels, and its command infrastructure, raise key questions we should all be asking about offensive cyber operations, such as, is there any degree of counter-value targeting that can surpass counter-force targeting in achieving a wartime objective? In that regard, is there any degree of counter-value success that can compensate for counter-force failures? Do we organizationally sell ourselves on counter-value approaches as a relatively simple plan B because counter-force operations are infinitely more difficult in terms of initial access, sustained prepositioning, targeted exploits, and timing? In other words, as air warfare historian Robert Pape puts it, are counter-value approaches driven mostly by bureaucratic interests and political pressures for cheap, ready-made solutions to what are inherently difficult problems? In Russia's case, at least, this generation-long fixation on the putative psychosocial effects of offensive cyber and information operations clearly incurred steep opportunity costs elsewhere. Immense human and resource expenditures went into mastering what I would call a pseudoscience of mass manipulation and subversion, all of which appears to have come at the cost of complementarity within the armed forces and counter-force proficiency against its opponents. Incidentally, this shortfall is why I found the UK's National Cyber Force recent embrace of a so-called cognitive effects doctrine somewhat concerning. If Ukraine has demonstrated nothing else over the course of the last decade, it is that cognition, suasion, and resolve are alluring yet extremely fickle targets. On a sustained basis, they may very well prove counterproductive, galvanizing the very opposite of the dynamics the attacker hopes to cultivate. As Jeffrey White argues in his recent history of psychological warfare, perhaps the most successful I/O campaign in history is the one we run against ourselves. He writes, quote, "Psychological warfare involves more than a series of practices and techniques to strategically manipulate individuals abroad. It involves the production of political fictions about itself and about the nature and reality of warfare more broadly." So finally, a word about correlation, which I would define as the degree to which our digital representation of the enemy and of the battlefield through cyberspace and now certainly artificial intelligence can approximate reality. Now, while I would argue, as some scholars do, that cyber is best suited and most revolutionary in terms of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, shocker coming from the former NSA guy, but I would once again quote Einstein: "Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted." This is certainly one lesson from Russia's war on Ukraine, as on paper, this conflict should have been as easy as Putin's minions had convinced themselves it would be. Just last month, political scientist James C. Scott passed away, and if you have not read his seminal work, Seeing Like a State, I would highly recommend it. Therein, he makes a similar case, distinguishing between the formalized, constructed knowledge that can be ascertained through technological, quantifiable means, and the tacit, context-specific, practical, improvisational skills and knowledge that are far more elusive. As soldiers have long understood, war has a way of taking on its own logic. And I would argue today that so too does technology and our dependence on it to make sense of the adversary and to map the battle space. Our digital age collection and targeting processes are founded on the premise of radical optimization, savings of time, energy, and resources, and efficiency. The resulting model of warfare is both a product of physical observation and digital construction. And thanks to cyberspace, this has become a process-driven, technocentric, and with any luck, comprehensible, calculable process. But as military theorist Martin van Creveld once wrote, the demands of this model can become an end unto themselves. Much like Pentagon officials convinced themselves in the late 1980s that only when every staffer has an email account will we finally be able to manage the deluge of information we face on a day-to-day basis. This logic, the folly of this logic is easy to see in hindsight. But as Van Creveld noted, efficiency is not synonymous with efficacy, and the two are more often at odds than we tend to recognize. So the technologies we employ to manage information economies threaten to propagate entirely new economies themselves, demanding ever more resources in a recursive cycle of innovation. And these insatiable demands for optimization risk leading us to conflate efficiency with proficiency and to adopt a scientific view of warfare. Consequently, militaries risk neglecting the physical demands of war in service of more granular digital representations. But as James C. Scott noted, quote, any large social process or event, including war, will inevitably be far more complex than the schemata we can devise, prospectively or retrospectively, to map it. Now, to that, I would add that most of what is currently branded as artificial intelligence is based on a statistical inference of past events, an uncritical embrace of which will quite literally lock us into fighting the last war. Now, cyber conflict was organizationally and theoretically born at the strategic level, drawing themes and insights from nuclear and air conflict. But I would argue that in recent years, we have gained a more robust and mature understanding of the limitations and opportunity and costs involved in maintaining a gaze at that level. Instead, as some cyber scholars have argued, we should reframe our thinking about cyberspace foremost as an arena for intelligence contests. And in my estimation, certainly from the perspective of Russia's performance in Ukraine, cyber and information operations have the best odds of success at that tactical and operational level with more circumspect mission objectives in mind. The risks, opportunity costs, and threat height at the strategic level have thus far simply failed to correspond to the practical realities of war. So just to recap a few major themes here. Number one, there may be a ceiling of efficacy for offensive cyber and information operations in conventional conflict. Number two, even considering those constraints, a counter-force approach may have longer odds, but likely more decisive impacts. And number three, espionage and ISR are likely to offer the biggest bang for our buck in cyberspace, with the caveat that we must be more critical of what the digital and the automated can truly represent about the realities of war. And in short, the future of cyber conflict demands that we question the degree to which offensive cyber and information operations might incur strategic impacts in physical space, decisive impacts in cognitive space, and opportunity costs elsewhere. And in short, a more humble and austere approach to the information domain is probably more prudent at this point. And with that, I'll close and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wild. Now I'll turn it over to Vice Admiral White.
Hey, how y'all doing this morning? All right. Couple questions just so I get a sense of the demographics of the audience. How many, anybody not U.S. Navy, raise your hand. Check. How many use iPhone? Android? Other? How many drive a car older than 10 years old? Okay, that's an excellent economic decision. Even considering that, all of you, based on the answers to those questions, are cyber warriors. It is in your life and it is in your force today, whether you appreciate it, love it, hate it, know it, or conscious or conscientious about it. A couple of thoughts. Admiral Berg, once again, I had to line out about 60% of my talking points because you already covered it. Mr. Wild, I find myself agreeing with one half of what you said, disagreeing with one half of what you said, and ruminating on the third half of what you said. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is reflective of the math in cyberspace. The parts don't always add up to the whole. I'd like to share with you, because I have a microphone, and the War College was gracious enough to invite me and foolish enough to give me a mic. Your role and responsibility as a warrior scholar is in the moment here and present for the next year that you are a student. Please do not miss or avoid an opportunity to embrace that role and to well and faithfully execute that responsibility. This is, after all, the Naval War College. That is your business to a point. And if all of us, the nation, our friends and allies are successful, deterrence will prevail. But history suggests that that's not always the case. A couple thoughts to frame your approach to what I'm going to tell you or offer to you. I'll be more polite. I'm going to make some assertions. I'm going to have some assumptions. I'm going to make some assessments. I would invite you to challenge and question every bit of it. That is reflective of a scholar. That is reflective of being intellectually honest and curious. So please do that. Second, in your profession and in your research and in your writings, I would encourage you to fight what I observed all too often in my career, which is the tendency inside the Pentagon and elsewhere in government service to conflate and complexify. If you choose to do the hard work, you can make it kind of simple and transparent. That does not mean it is easy. So please do what you can to simplify your perspective so that you can arrive at the core truths and facts of the matter. Third, I think you have an opportunity here to do perhaps what you haven't been given the time to do in other parts of your career and tours, and that is to simply think and give yourselves time to do that and try to do it smarter, better, and more flexibly perhaps than you have in the past. As part of an academic institution, I would encourage you to embrace the idea that data can and should change your mind if it warrants. Please do the thinking about that. And then last, pursue that which is true, important, and counterintuitive. I think that that can be really important. One of my assumptions about all of you is that you are accomplished technicians with some experience at the low operational level of war. One of my assertions is that getting to the next level is what your year here can be about. So it is a lot of reading if you do it. And if you want to aspire to be a good thinker, do the damn reading. Like, seriously, no shit. Spend the time and do the reading. Your disciplined rigor in this pursuit will pay dividends for your career. And to some of the comments that Mr. Weber said this morning about pursuing the star, okay, maybe. Be your own champion, champion others, champion mavericks. But if you want to go for a star, then I think you need to be prepared to work hard and be disciplined in your approach. I think it's really important because in my assessment, we are giving to you as a nation, we are giving to you a national strategy which is not resourced. And so you have too many requirements, your missions are very challenging and hard, and you don't have the capacity to execute them all. And so the only way that you will be successful, in my view, is you have to think better and faster and smarter than the other guy. Okay, Now I'll go back to some of my earlier thoughts. Observations about Russia and Ukraine, which is why I was asked to come here. Drones and autonomy, whether fully autonomous or automated, that's a no-shitter. It's a real thing, and it is here. And if in your community and your warfighting discipline you are fighting it, you will lose, okay? It is legit, it is credible, it is relevant, it is fast-paced. You only have to look at how Ukraine, under-resourced and with an existential threat, is figuring out how to maneuver and solve and be agile. Drones on land are different, as we have heard about drones on sea. It looks to my view that Russia and Ukraine are generally in trench warfare, a la 1914 to 1918, with drone-enabled sensors and munitions. They seem to be contesting single-digit kilometers of real estate. They are not having overwhelming movement advantage at scale on land. At sea, on the other hand, a nation which has no navy has compelled extraordinary loss on what is plausibly the third or fifth largest and most capable, competent navy on the globe today. Talk about asymmetry. It is stunning. So I just encourage you to think about that. The second thing I would say, in a fight with allies and coalition partners, foreign disclosure is a fire, okay? And we suck at it in the United States military. There have been some remarkable changes, I think, beginning with what the National Security Agency and the U.S. intelligence community began to do in the fall of 2021 and the early winter of 22, trying to aggressively release information gotten through sensitive sources and methods in order to prepare the battle space. And I think, just as you observe, for those of you that have been in the EUCOM theater and savvy to the fight, the better we are at informing our allies and partners and exchanging ideas with them, the better we will be on the ground. And so that is some sort of foreign disclosure as a fires, I think, is increasingly important. Thinking about technology, in the Navy that I came up in, I grew up with a lot of mil-spec hardware, which functioned like all the other commercial hardware, but it was more expensive because it was kind of like mostly like shock vibe capacity, as opposed to necessarily performance. And we spent a little bit of time thinking about dual-use technology. I think we've gone through 2+ decades of diffusion of technology, which was really enabled, as Admiral Berg mentioned out, operations in cyberspace and how the marketplace pursued aggressively by a nation-state actor, China, has been able to accelerate their competitiveness on the global economic stage. And I think now we are probably beginning to witness technology decoupling. Russia is operating on a fully mobilized wartime economy with very little dependencies. There are some things that the West has not done that they could do in terms of more effective sanctions, I suspect, but for some reason we haven't chosen to do that. China is working very, very hard to have an organic, everything built in China by a born-on date in a couple of years. And that's going to be an interesting proposition when we tell ourselves that we are a global economic power and we can use the motivations or deterrence value of sanctions. But if you are technology decoupled, that suggests that you might be increasingly economically decoupled, and some of those levers of national power that we're familiar with might go away. A couple things about efficacy of cyber operations. I agree with a lot of what has been said here about it's difficult to know, it's opaque in terms of assessment, the data is sometimes difficult to arrive at. But if you were to ask President Zelensky perhaps 2 years ago, some of those things that enabled his ability to remain a sovereign, for Ukraine to remain independent, and to exercise their sovereignty on a global stage, one might offer operations that Microsoft Corporation did in taking all of the domestic data, which in a digital frame of reference defines a sovereign entity's identity, offshoring it from the Ukrainian domestic law that it had to be housed on server farms and data centers in Ukraine, and they put it into a secure cloud. That's an example where taking advantage of the borderless environment of cyberspace, an increasingly difficult problem perhaps, President Zelensky was able to exercise effective sovereignty on the global stage and communicate as a sovereign to other sovereign nations in places like the United Nations. The other thing might be, love him or hate him, Mr. Musk has done some pretty amazing technology development and delivering essentially at his single decision with no stroke of the pen, absorbing all of the costs, at least in the initial 6 months or so of the conflict, the ability for the National Command Authority of Ukraine to command, for the tactical commanders to signal and control, and for the wherewithal of the Ukrainian identity to be preserved and protected. And if you don't think that that was, at least to a degree, a function of Starlink and SpaceX, then I would encourage you to look at the data. And if you find data that is contrary to what I've asserted, I will change my mind. Happy to do so. And then I am in complete agreement that operations in Ukraine, they've been going on for a long time, many decades and perhaps centuries in that part of the world. But in a modern sense, 2014 is when the conflict in 2022 arguably started. And you can take a look at operations such as NotPetya, a Russian-attributed malware campaign directed at international businesses in the tax base in Ukraine in 2017 that also went a little sideways as sort of an example of an attempt of maneuver and fires in cyberspace. And I too agree that it's difficult to get a sense of what is next, what is coming, how to measure. And it's not just hurricanes in Florida and South Carolina that impact the ability of people to come here today. Had we been trying to do this on Friday 2 weeks ago, as I was traveling and woke up to the notification that my flight was canceled because of a third-party vendor, cybersecurity operator, unintentional fire and effect inside 9.5 million endpoint computers around the globe. And that certainly had a measurable effect. The courts and the insurance companies will sort that over the next decade or more. So just some thoughts on that. What do I think about the U.S. in all of this? I think we would do better if we would understand our strengths and our weaknesses. And we probably conflate our strengths and we perhaps mislead or intentionally misunderstand our weaknesses. I think some of our strengths are competition and innovation. I think we understand competition to a degree consistent with our national character and identity, and I think we still today are a global leader in innovation. I think some of our weaknesses revolve around how we deliver and define requirements inside the Department of Defense and interpreting national strategy to a defense strategy, to a service strategy that look like requirements that become weapon systems, platforms, and capabilities delivered to the fleet and joint force. You all have a role in making sure that not only do you understand how to employ weapon systems and combat capability, but you also, I would encourage you to think hard about trying to unpack some of those defining requirements. You may find in those requirements some stuff that got missed in 1983 when it was written and funded and is still in operations today. I think some of our strengths are partnerships. And I think one of our most extraordinary strengths at present is our national intelligence community. We are pretty remarkable. I am, in fact, very biased on that. So you should absolutely question any of my assertions or assessments about that. I would offer to you, back to some of the keynote speakers' thoughts about the efficacy of the U-boats in the North Atlantic. Absolutely. And what the Imperial Japanese Navy did with Pearl Harbor in 1941 and the year run up to that, absolutely. I have two words for you, enigma and purple. And if you don't know what that is, I would encourage you to understand the strategic consequence of making a national decision through allies and partners. I think the first Enigma machine that was delivered to the United Kingdom was from the Poles in the early 30s that enabled that next decade of very difficult applied and theoretical math and physics to ultimately build the bomb that resulted in effective origin story of the United States 10th Fleet, a numbered fleet established in World War II with no assigned assets, with the mission to operationalize information and intelligence to defeat the U-boats in the North Atlantic. And then, of course, the apocryphal story for naval intelligence, which was about, of course, excellence in craft and tradecraft and knowledge. But they would also be the first to say they got lucky also at Midway. But they would never have had an opportunity for luck, which is where opportunity meets the prepared mind, without the preparedness of insight into Imperial Japanese code making. I believe we have a problem with our national industrial capacity. We can do a lot, but we're probably not yet well geared or understood the way we were able to prepare starting in about 1938, 1939 to get Detroit mobilized to be the arsenal of democracy, beginning very rapidly in the mid-40s and into the duration of the war. We need to work with our allies and partners, and I think NATO and Europe is actually demonstrating the capability where we can integrate together those necessary warfighting stocks. I think there is a truism about war, and victory in war requires overcapacity. You need to have an extraordinarily deep reservoir of consumable everything, and not just technology, but unfortunately, bodies. If you want to, in war, given the discussions about changing or unchanging character and nature, and if you're prepared to commit as a military leader of a maneuver formation in combat, that is what you will need to be prepared to do. And I think you have the charge to work very hard, to be passionate, to advocate for that capacity. I do think that we have extraordinary capability. Whatever the weapon systems are or aren't that we do deliver, and whether they are perfect and proper in everything that they do, I think that they are, in fact, world-class. They are best in breed. So from a technology standpoint, I don't think that there are any better. I do think that our margin of advantage is getting narrower and narrower and flatter and flatter. So a couple things just in closing. You've heard a little bit about how do you understand the cost of the business that we're in. I don't have a good answer for you, but I would encourage you to think a little bit, whether it's in this tour or in some, unfortunately, painful tour in the Pentagon in the future, you will be asked at times because of your budget submission or maybe some testimony you'll be doing in front of Congress, you know, how does that support the cost of defense? And it might be sometimes difficult to answer that question, but a really good answer is, I may not know how it supports the cost of defense, but I do know that it makes America worth defending. Okay, and that is a little bit about the ideals of our narrative, our culture, how we choose to see ourselves, and why we must always aspire to be the good guy. And we can have conversations over beer and bourbon or other about what that line is and how you define it and what it starts. But aspiring and then following through with discipline and rigor on being the good guy is a really good thing. Okay, a couple closing thoughts, because I am a Navy guy, and I miss the mission, and I miss the sailors, and I miss the Joint Force. I learned early in my life that in that really unmemorable plebe summer, I try to forget it every day, there's a couple things you remember, and one of those are your rating knowledge that you had to master in theory as a plebe. John Paul Jones, men mean more than guns in the rating of a ship. Okay, honestly, you're here because you are men and women, you are people, you are thinkers, and you are leaders. And you have an opportunity to demonstrate every day of your future that decisions you make and the way you lead, how you lead, why you lead, can make people overperform what they think they're capable of. And I would just invite you, you're already good, or you wouldn't be here. So think about how you get, better. This is the Naval War College. There's a guy who's a former president here, Art Zebrowski. Art Zebrowski came up with a couple of ideas in the mid to late 90s, which I think didn't get fully realized, or perhaps they were poorly implemented, that I think might be more and more relevant today as we go forward. One of them was net-centric warfare. And you might call that cyberspace today, or some derivative of cyberspace today, or a domain called cyberspace and operations in that space. But it's not just about IT or network, but it is about the power of a network of people and converged missions, okay? That I do believe that there are some technical dependencies which you all should become more adept at understanding and utilizing if you really want to upgun and upskill and upshift your fighting mission because of the dependency on being network-centric. The last is his concept of street fighter, right? A vision 25 years ago about a ship that might be real and relevant at large numbers, generally small form factor and profile, and high speed and agile. And I don't think in 1999, there was an awful lot of discussion about a possible conflict in the South China Sea. But just imagine if we had done the traditional naval approach to designing and implementing and fielding, 150 street fighters and what they could do today. And we might be having a different story in the South China Sea or inside the First Island chain had we fielded that kind of a capability. I'm not saying displace the aircraft carrier. I too love Top Gun as a movie, but I think the future is going to be less manned aviation and more autonomous aviation. That's just a simple approach to reality. 2,500 pounds of life support on a modern aircraft to keep him alive at 9 Gs, and they are building weapons that are pulling excess at 30 Gs on maneuver. The math kinematically just doesn't work out in the long term. Back to net-centric warfare. Okay, I leave you with a book recommendation, which I came across 6 weeks ago. I bought it, I read it very quickly on a red-eye flight from LA to DC. Very entertaining. It's called The Stars and the Oceans by Mark Halperin. He's a writer of fiction. He's a thinker, a critiquer of national defense and security policy. It's a good Navy story. It's a good yarn. It's also a love story, so I was tearing up right there over flyover country. It made me think a little bit if I could be as good of a leader as the character in that book. And of course, it was a Navy SWO, just so you know. And I just commend it to you. It's a good read. You can make it a slow read because it's very, very thought-provoking. I think it's also relevant in the present sense about how our joint force and our Navy might find itself distracted, possibly from a main thing, and how you, in whatever your service and mission capacity, might find yourself on the front end of a battle where you will be expected to do more than you imagine you're capable of doing. But as a leader, you have to find the grit and the resolve and the imagination to lead. And it was good. Fred, over to you.
Wow. Wow, okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank all three of our panelists. They were awesome. They did exactly what I wanted, which was presenting a number of competing hypotheses, I think, out there. I don't think everybody agreed 100%. And you got three very different perspectives on a number of topics relevant to what we're doing here today.